Kia ora, buenas tardes, boa tarde. Lovely to see you all today and here in Wellington. It's a real pleasure to have so many of you here from a range of backgrounds. We've got some ambassadors who I'll introduce shortly. We've got some dignitaries of the Cape and the university world. And we've got you from government agencies, from businesses, from all walks of life here in Wellington. So thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's Wellington launch of two really pivotal resources for the Latin America Cape. One, as you'll soon see, and you're probably aware because you've seen the ads for this event, is an economic report from Sense Partners, the economic consultancy. The other is a series of videos, and you might think they're quite different resources, and in some ways they are, but as hopefully you'll see by the end of our time together, they're beautifully complementary. Just a few people I'd like to welcome first. We have three ambassadors with us today. The ambassadors of Cuba, bienvenido, Argentina, and Peru. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We have the Dean of Business from the Wellington School of Business and Government. We have the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Blair McRae from Victoria University of Wellington. We also have Alan Bollard here from the chair of the Capes Advisory Board. And if you don't know who the Capes are, you will in about 2 minutes. I just see if there's anyone else here. We also have a couple of actually quite important people. We've got Peter Gilbert from Tertiary Education Commission, and also two people who helped shape the report, and I'll explain that more in just a little bit. So if we can just go briefly through the event outline today. What we're going to do, we'll be introducing, after this introduction, I'll pass over to John Ballingal from Sense Partners to present the economic report. Then there'll be some business videos. We'll have some Q&A, concluding remarks from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and some networking. So for those of you who don't know the Capes, what the Capes are, just a very brief introduction. 3 centres based at universities, backed by a consortium of 4 universities. The other 2 centres are on North Asia and Southeast Asia. And we were created to help transfer academic knowledge to prepare New Zealanders to engage more with the Asia Pacific in their chosen walk of life. If they're business, do more business. If they're students, have more contact with peers and more understanding of the region. And if they're school kids, then just get to know the region. So those are our primary audiences. We do a range, we've been going about 5 years or just over 5 years, a range of initiatives related to business and those other audiences. We have in the Latin America Cape, if you like, an additional mission on top of the other Capes. We're all meant to help New Zealanders be better prepared to engage with the Asia Pacific. It's a capacity building exercise, transferring academic knowledge to civil society. With the Latin America Cape, however, we've got this additional thing. We actually have to put Latin America on the map because many New Zealanders don't think automatically of Latin America as an option for their relationship. And so the Latin America Cape has developed a variety of initiatives to help businesses and other audiences understand the opportunity. So I won't go through all these, but I'll just briefly say the ones on the left are pre-COVID and the ones on the right are COVID era. The ones on the left, series of case studies, a report we did with New Zealand Story, some videos of New Zealanders succeeding in Brazil. So these are all on our website. And so please use our website, which you'll see at the end, to access these resources, because there's some real gold in there. On the right, we've got some of the activities we did since COVID hit, webinars, North American supply chains, for example, which may well come up today. If we could go to the next slide, these are some of our current initiatives. And again, I'm emphasizing the business ones because this is an economic report and business videos. If this was an education audiences, I'd be talking about our school resources. I think the flagship one is the dealer program, Diversifying into Latin America. It's a series of workshops, 8 weeks of workshops, where a small cohort of businesses get to know each other, get to know the region. Don't have time to go through them all, but just to say really quickly, we have several programs connecting students and businesses, which makes sense because they're both our audiences. And we've also done polling of businesses in the public on New Zealand and Latin America. what are the perceptions of the region? Lastly, still to come, a promo. We've got another dealer cohort opening. We probably will close applications now at the early September, but there are a variety of activities we're doing and which the Capes as a whole are doing. The ones that we're doing are on Latin America, obviously, but all the Capes are doing a variety of ones. A couple of ones at the bottom there worth briefly talking about, because this is a world driven by data, where our culture is increasingly visual. We're developing a range of projects called under the headline Wayfinding to show data, and we're also going to be developing the Cultural and Creative Industries website. But you're not here to hear all that. You're here to hear John and our economic report. So just before, couple of words just before we get underway there. This report has two origins. Foreign Affairs approached us to see if we wished to be involved with this report. And the thinking was, well, the world has changed significantly since COVID. Where does Latin America fit in New Zealand's international relationships, business and otherwise? So we thought some objective data there could really help be useful for ministers, be useful for other audiences in understanding where things are going. Why did the Latin America Cape get involved? Well, people like ourselves who are true champions of the region could be accused of having a self-interest in promoting it. Indeed, we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't. So we need some objective data to actually say, to actually check whether our claims are accurate. So this is why we thought MFAT and ourselves thought it would be a good idea to do an economic report using respected economists who are also brilliant communicators. No pressure, John. To explain how they see the pros and cons of trade with Latin America. Last couple of points before I hand over to John. The Capes, as I said a minute or two ago, are here to transfer academic knowledge. So one of the groups advising this has been a set of academics. So we've got Jesse Perini from the School of Business who advised it. And we also had some agency groups to actually show that it was relevant to government. So we have Ana Azevedo from Education New Zealand. So over to you, John. I'll introduce the respondents after you've spoken, but please, can you summarise the report for us?
First of all, thank you very much to the Cape, to Matthew and to MFAT for funding the study. Thanks to the advisory boards, both the academic and the policy advisory boards. They really helped us shape our narrative and make sure that we got the right stories involved and that we understood some of the nuances that the data alone doesn't show. So today I'd just like to take you through our report. We'll have a quick look at some of the numbers, and then we'll talk about some of the opportunities, challenges, and takeaways for businesses in particular. So obviously, Latin America is a very large and very diverse region and contains 20 economies. It simply wasn't possible to go into detail on all of them. There wasn't the time or the resources to do so. So in agreement with the Cape, we decided to focus on 6 key markets, and those are the ones I'll talk about today. Those were chosen largely because we've got a fairly strong economic relationship with many of them. We have trade agreements with some of them. Doesn't mean that the other markets aren't important, of course. It's just we had to make some tough choices around where we looked. In some of the charts you'll see we compare against some other countries from Asia. And the reason why we do that is because you can't say that a trade barrier is high unless you compare it to another region. So it just provides a bit of context. So in all of these slides that you see, we do provide this comparison, but we're not suggesting that Latin America and Southeast Asia in particular are substitutes in any way. It's just a point of reference. Okay, some numbers. So, it's around a $1.1 billion market for New Zealand in terms of goods and services. It's the orange one along the bottom there. So to put that in context, that's around half as much as we export to the UK and about a third of what we export to Germany. As with many economies around the world who we've been exporting to for a while, there's only one real story, and it's China. A lot of attention has gone on China, both from the business perspective and also from the government perspective. And obviously, you can see those numbers going up very strongly at the top. So that has drawn a lot of resources and a lot of exporter energy away from other regions, including Latin America. Again, not saying that's a good or a bad thing, just a fact. So it's a relatively flat line for Latin America at around 1.1 billion, and it stayed fairly resilient throughout the pandemic, which is encouraging, especially on the goods front. We'll talk about services in a moment. When we get down to the country level, to the economy level, there's a bit more volatility, and you'd expect that. Most notably, we can see Venezuela there was our largest market for quite some time, largely for dairy products. But obviously a few things have happened there which meant it's not quite so easy to do business with right now. So our exports to Venezuela went from 500 million to around 500,000. And some of that product you can see has been rediverted to other parts of Latin America, and you can see some fairly strong pockets of growth in Chile, Peru and Brazil, at least over a 10-year period. And some really strong recent growth into Mexico as well. Tough time to be a services exporter, and as you know, many of you are education exporters here, I don't need to tell you that. This is a really positive story, I think, underlying the data, and hopefully we can get back to pre-pandemic trends relatively quickly. But really strong growth across most of our Latin American focus markets there for our services exports. Unsurprisingly, the pandemic hammered them and has been particularly tough for Latin American markets for New Zealand exporters. And that's because, as we'll see in a moment, education and tourism make up the vast majority of our services exports to Latin America, around 70%. That's actually quite a lot higher than with other markets such as the US, where business services, IT services play a larger role. Those sorts of services didn't get hit quite so hard by COVID, whereas closed borders meant education and tourism did. So yeah, there really is not a lot else beyond personal travel, which is an archaic Statistics New Zealand way of saying tourism and education. But you can see in that red bar in the middle there on personal travel, compound annual growth rate, so average growth of over 12% in the 5 years preceding COVID. That's really encouraging, and it's not just about the export revenue that education in particular delivers. It's about the relationships and the understanding that education exchanges and exports bring as well. So obviously it's been a lot tougher. It's dropped by around 70%. But hey, things are starting to open up, and hopefully we get back to a more positive outcome there. Okay, so on to some of the challenges. There's been a lot written and a lot said around Latin America, and I think the challenge, part of the reason why we have, or some people have these perceptions of Latin America, is because they talk about it, as I just did, as one whole region. And that's convenient, but obviously there's 20 economies and they all have their different opportunities, challenges, strengths and weaknesses. So one phrase you often hear is it's a very volatile region. Growth goes up and down. And that's true to an extent, but it's nowhere near as significant as you might expect. So this chart shows average incomes in GDP per capita in the purple bars there, and then the volatility of economic growth in the green bars there. So you can see average incomes are comparable to a lot of Southeast Asian economies. And the volatility is, yes, it is slightly higher, but it's not off the charts. Much of the volatility is similar to somewhere like Thailand, for example. So I think we just need to be quite careful running the line that Latin America is a very volatile place to do business, and their economies are up and down a lot. There's a little bit of truth to it, but not as much as is commonly perceived. Okay, so what else might explain why our exports to Latin America haven't grown enormously in recent years? So for this, we did some fancy econometrics, and I'm going to put up all of the equations in a minute because Matthew told me you loved equations on a Friday afternoon. So we did some economic modeling that just tried to identify what drives trade costs apart from distance. We know that distance is important for trade costs and trade barriers. So this chart shows this trade cost index, which includes things like tariffs, non-tariff barriers, cultural differences, language barriers, a whole range of different things that make doing business slightly more complicated. And we've just plotted them there, compared them against our comparator countries. And what this shows is that for a given amount of distance away from New Zealand, these are measured from major port to major port, from New Zealand to these countries, it is more costly to do business in Latin America. So I don't think that's necessarily a big surprise, but it was useful, I think, to put some empirics around that to confirm it. So these, the technicalities of it don't really matter, although I'm sure Alan Bollard's going to ask a question about it afterwards. What this shows is costs relative to the US, to exporting to the US. What you can see is Mexico is a bit of a standout in a positive way, and it shows that trade costs for Mexico going into the US are relatively low. So I think that's quite useful if you're a New Zealand business thinking about how do I access North America, and we've seen it with Fisher and Paykel and others. One way is through Mexico. We also looked at tariffs and non-tariff measures. Tariffs, on average, aren't particularly high in Latin America. There are some pockets, some spikes on certain products that I know MFAT is very keen to get rid of and are working hard on it. But it is the non-tariff barriers that, or measures, sorry, that impose the most costs on New Zealand businesses trying to do business with Latin America. So these non-tariff measures might be things like certification, health requirements. It's basically sort of the red tape conformity measures that you need to meet in order to do business. And you can see that in Latin America, some of these are quite high compared to Southeast Asia. But look at China's number. It's pretty clear that the extent of non-tariff measures is not a clear predictor of trade patterns. It's not stopping us doing a bucket load of trade with China. So again, it's another factor which is real. There are non-tariff barriers and measures in place which make it more difficult to do business, but these are present everywhere. Okay, looking forward a little bit there. You can see this is economic growth across our 6 key markets. The impacts of COVID are very clear, and then we get a fairly strong bounce back in red. It's actually last year. These numbers are a little bit out of date, but the patterns won't have changed very much. And what we can see is a forecast return to sort of stable, solid growth of around 2, 3, 4% across our key Latin American markets. Now, these are just forecasts. Right now, forecasting is a mug's game. It's always a mug's game, but right now it's very, very challenging. But if things don't all implode around the world and there's not another pandemic, we're looking at an outlook of relatively stable and relatively solid growth, which I think bodes well for business planning. But of course, economic growth is highly dependent on the policy choices that governments make. And one area, well, we see 2 key areas where policy reforms, policy changes could see the picture for New Zealand exporters getting slightly better in Latin America. The first one is around infrastructure. This chart just measures infrastructure quality against income per capita. And you can generally see that countries who have higher quality infrastructure tend to have higher GDP per capita, or perhaps the relationship's the other way around. Either way, it points up in that direction. And again, what you can see is some of our Latin American markets here perhaps have a little bit more work to do relative to some of the Asian comparators to lift the quality of infrastructure. That's going to support productivity growth, business growth, income growth, and ultimately that's going to determine how much they want to buy from New Zealand. The other area where we would love to see more action is around further free trade agreements, deepening existing trade agreements, so that the formal barriers to trade can be lessened. Okay, opportunities. So in the report, we have 6 to 8 case studies across a wide range of areas. And we really enjoy doing these because as much as I love spreadsheets and numbers and modeling, nothing beats going out and talking to people. And I know as economists, we don't do that very well. But we went and spoke to these businesses, and their insights were really helpful in helping us shape our views. And there was a lot of commonality of themes, which we'll come to in a minute. But you know, really, the overall messages that came through all of these case studies in some shape or other is, don't look at Latin America as a singular region. Try and identify certain pockets within it that are going to suit your business. Start forming relationships, be there for the long haul. And also highlighted the importance of collaboration. When trade costs are high, it's not easy to get into some of these markets. So all of the case study businesses who we spoke to, and a lot of the agencies we spoke to as well, said, you've got to build relationships. And it might sound simple. All exporters have to build relationships. But you don't have to do it quite so much going into Australia or the US because it's a more familiar system. Another key theme was that if you're in it to make a quick buck in Latin America, you're probably going to be sorely disappointed. There's nothing wrong with being opportunistic, but you really do need to be in there for the long haul because there's going to be a few ups and downs. There is going to be some volatility, and depending on which market you're in, you know, those could be quite a lot up and down. But if you're in it for the long haul, you know what you're trying to achieve, you've got these relationships with people on the ground. The most successful businesses in our case studies employed people on the ground to help them get through some of the legal systems, the contracting processes, the local government systems, all of those things. Very hard to do sitting here in Wellington or Auckland. You've got a local who you trust on the ground there. They can ease it through for you. You don't have to think about it. And yeah, as I said before, these are challenges that are faced in most markets. I mean, if you're exporting into China right now, you know, there's a big push from New Zealand government to try and diversify trade because of what's happened to Australia and some of those concerns. There are risks everywhere. There are risks exporting to the UK. You've got political risks over there. We've seen in the US plenty of political risk there in the past few years. So, yes, there are challenges going into Latin America, but there are opportunities too. And it's just a matter of being very clear on what you're trying to achieve and why and how long you're in it for. Okay. So if we had to sum it up in just a few pithy bullet points, which is what we do as consultants, collaboration is key. Try and work out who you can build relationships with. One of the case studies was around providing agricultural equipment into Latin America. You might think Latin America is quite good at producing primary products, so are we. Probably not going to be a lot of trade opportunities there. But that's not how modern supply chains work. Supply chains have got multiple chunks. We think there's good opportunities for us to work with Latin American primary producers to give them our productivity enhancing machinery like packing equipment or sorting equipment. And indeed, that's one of the fastest growing areas for New Zealand at the moment. Talked about having a long-term view and people on the ground. And ultimately, you know, be clear-eyed about it. There is uncertainty. There's uncertainty in any market. But history shows that, that there will be these challenges, but if you're prepared for the uncertainty, if you've got a bit of balance sheet depth to ride it through and you're prepared to stick with it, we think there's a lot of unfulfilled potential in Latin America. And at a time when New Zealand businesses are quite rightly thinking about the portfolio of their investments across markets, we think Latin America deserves another look.
Thank you very much, John. That was a great summary of the project and its findings. Before we go into the business videos, we're going to tease them out with today's panelists. So could I actually invite our two panelists to join us up the front here? We're going to have a few minutes of questions. I'm going to present them to the panelists. If there's a time, we'll get one or two in, especially if any of you have to leave a little bit early. And then we'll show you these videos afterwards. But before I'd like to introduce our two panelists. It's Professor Gustavo Flores Macias of Cornell University and Nick Fogarty, a former Executive Vice President for the Asia Pacific for Sequent, which is an globally award-winning software technology company in geoscience. So they'll have a word or two to say about the report in a minute. But firstly, some questions to John. And we are, even though we're in a small room and we don't really need a mic, we are recording this, and so we need to pass the mic back and forth for that purpose. So apologies if it looks a little clunky. John, this isn't the first report you've done like this. You've done many reports like this, including one on China and the United States the last 12 months. How is this report similar to those how is this Latin American report similar to those in its methodology and its findings, and how is it different?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. The methodology is largely similar. Look at the data, torture it until it screams, speak to some businesses, hopefully don't have to make them scream. And also then just try and sit back a bit and pull out the main themes as well that are supported by both the data and the case studies. And we found that's a really successful way of getting into these projects. I think the big difference between Latin America and the US and China is just the breadth of the economic relationships is a bit narrower, much wider in the US and China for the sheer breadth of things that we export there. And that tends to see less volatility in the headline numbers, whereas with Latin America, it is quite narrowly focused on just a few products at the moment. But at the same time, we're seeing a huge amount of growth in things like medical equipment, sleep apnea equipment, packaging machinery. That was exactly the same for the US. So I think New Zealand exporters are learning to identify where they fit into some of these regional and global supply chains, finding their niche and absolutely nailing it. So the other common theme is that, yeah, exporting's tricky. There are risks everywhere. And you've got to be very strategic and make sure you're informed by speaking to MFAT, to NZTE, to CAPE, to other business associations, to your own colleagues. These are all things which are fairly basic, but essential if we're to achieve export success.
Quick question, quick follow-up, did any of the findings surprise you? You got to know Latin America, I mean, you know this area in great depth, but Latin America is probably your deepest encounter, possibly your deepest encounter. Anything surprise you in what you found?
I think perhaps looking at the data in particular, the thing that surprised me most was just the strength of the education linkages. It was much higher than in a number of other markets that I've analysed. And I think that gives the relationship a slightly different context, because you start building those relationships from a young age. You start building understanding, and this is the sort of important work that the CAPE does. And a few of the businesses that we spoke to, their contacts on the ground in Latin America had come to study in New Zealand, or they visited for a holiday, extended working holiday, something like that. So I think it really showed to me the linkages between education, not as a revenue generator, but as a a relationship generator, which then pays off further down the track. And I don't think that's quite the same with some of the other markets I've looked at.
Thank you. Let's bring in the panelists now. First, we'll go international here. Gustavo, you're an Associate Vice Provost for International Affairs at Cornell, a Professor of Government and Public Policy there. You've directed a Latin American Studies program there, and you're an award-winning teacher there and at Harvard. So, but you're not all that familiar with New Zealand. So as someone sort of coming to a country for the first time, you've been here, I think, 24 hours. We won't ask you, how do you like it, as a lot of Kiwis do, but we will ask you, how useful did you find this report as an introduction to a new country's economic ties with your region?
Thank you, Matthew, and I'd like to just start by thanking Matthew in particular, everybody that made this visit, my visit, possible. Thank you, and thank you to CAPE as well for the opportunity to be here. I would also like to start by congratulating everybody that was behind this report. I mean, I found it to be a thoughtful, nuanced, and thorough report on the state of affairs of New Zealand, Latin America relations, and in particular the opportunities ahead and some of the challenges certainly. But I think it's a very well done report. I think there are several key insights from the report, but perhaps I'd like to highlight three, if I could. The first one, it really is eye-opening. Sort of a lot of people think about China and the United States as these big markets, perhaps the European Union, but a lot of people miss just the size of the market and in terms of the opportunity in Latin America. And this is something the report I think does very nicely. You know, just to provide an additional layer of context. If we think about just the Brazilian and Mexican economies together, we're at about the Japanese GDP, right? So just think about the magnitude of the opportunities. This is larger than the GDP of India, for instance, which is another big market that people often think about. Along these lines, shifting a little bit away from the size and into the dynamism of economic growth, you know, if we look at some of the larger countries in the report, say Peru is growing at 4.5%, you know, Chile, 3%. Some of the countries maybe not in the report, like the Dominican Republic, growing at 5%. So quite a bit of opportunity there as well. If we think about population, right, Latin America as a whole has about 700 million people. If we think about the EU, that's about 450 million. So also quite sizable market there. The second aspect I would like to highlight, the second insight that I think the report does very nicely, is this favorable macro environment that is taking shape in the region, and like it is very valuable for commercial relationships between New Zealand and Latin America. I'm thinking about responsible economic fiscal policies. I'm thinking about, you know, inflation is a major topic right now, but inflation control, I think the region has had a tradition and taking inflation very seriously over several decades now. I remember speaking with a former minister of the economy in Chile and asking him about inflation and how ideology came into play. And he said, you know, inflation is not about being on the left or the right. It's not about being socialist or not. Inflation you need to take seriously regardless. And I think this is true for most of the region today. And with, I think, some of the tailwinds that we have with energy prices that also are helping purchasing power and just the ability to engage in additional trade, this will be important to consider as well. The last thing I'll say that I'd like to highlight is that the report not only identifies these opportunities very nicely, but I think it also provides a sense of important avenues to move forward and to act on these opportunities. It very clearly identifies the investment in infrastructure and education as a major avenue moving forward, as well as just the expansion of market access. And it highlights the need not to try to compete directly with similar products in Latin America, let's say dairy and so on, but really to find opportunities to come in and bring value added in existing markets along the chain, and perhaps find places in Latin America that are major importers of products, say dairy and others. But these are I think nuanced insights that the report brings to the table. So there's so much to like about the report. These are three that I'll just leave for now. congratulations again.
Thank you, Gustavo. Just to follow up for you, as a public policy academic, we've got a few agencies in the room, government agencies. This is the political capital of New Zealand. Do you see any particular insights which agencies could take from the report as they shape New Zealand policy towards the region?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the report can serve as a blueprint in terms of policy moving forward. And perhaps one angle that I'd like to highlight is, the geopolitical state of affairs today. And people look at the United States, maybe historically, as dominating commercial relations with Latin America. But recently, China has moved in considerably. And today, China is the #1 trade partner of South America, right? So if we look at South America only within Latin America, China has become #1. I think it's safe to say that the sort of US-China relations will continue deteriorating in the near term. And this will force countries in Latin America and elsewhere in the world, in a way, to have to take sides, right? I mean, this is something that we see often. It's, I think, unfortunate for many countries, but Latin America will be one of the regions in the world trying to navigate sort of being caught between China and the United States. So I think this is where there is a lot of room for action when it comes to, say, New Zealand looking for opportunities in Latin America, because it'll open the door to like-minded countries, say, countries that share a lot of culturally and in terms of a worldview with the United States, with Latin America, with Canada, the Western world more generally. And I think this is a major opportunity for New Zealand. I think this is something that the report, again, presents some important avenues, but this is where I see a lot of action taking place and capitalizing on this opportunity.
Thank you, Gustavo. Nick, this is a couple of questions for you. For those who don't know Nick, he's a commercial lawyer who's worked for NZTE. He spent the last 20 years advising on and implementing global sales initiatives. He's established a firm to support business founders, CEOs and boards of growth companies deliver on their objectives. So he's our business representative today. So Nick, can I ask you, how do you think exporters who are thinking about Latin America for the first time could use this report in making their business decisions?
Well, thanks, Matthew, and I'll just reiterate Gustavo's comments. It's great to be here and appreciate the opportunity to be with this panel. Hopefully that's working. No, it's a pleasure being here. So, as Matthew said, I've had the pleasure of spending the last 9 years with a company called Sequent, and we've grown a pretty significant business in Latin America, around 50 people, 30 million US turnover per year. So we went through really the full growth range of suddenly arriving in the country and needing to set up a business. So when I read the report, it really made me reflect on some of those initial moves. And I think there's a few things that I think exporters would take out of a report like this. The first is, whenever looking at a new market in a region, and I'll take your point, John, around it's a region, but it's a series of individual economies, doing the background work is absolutely critical. And I think this report's a really great macro resource to at least start to understand where the growth may exist, where the opportunities may exist. Sitting below that, a company obviously needs to sit down and do their own research on the industry they're in and look at opportunities. But absolutely, there's a lot to take out of the report in terms of detail on sectors and tailwinds and the like. And I really thought the work around currencies and instability of things like that was actually quite telling when you look at it against the Asian comparatives, which is great because, as you say, there's often a bit of a generalization around instability in the region, and of course it's far more nuanced than that. I think probably the second thing to think about with a report like this is the case studies. And I'd be a bit biased on that because we're, I think, one of them. But one of the things we did when we went to Latin America was call up every New Zealand company operating in Latin America we could and had a conversation and really asked them not so much what went well, because that's often quite apparent, but really what wouldn't you do looking back on your experience. So I'd really recommend exporters, reaching out to the Cape, reaching out to other New Zealand companies, and just taking advantage of any resources possible to reduce risk, Matthew.
Thanks, Nick. How about advising, how would the report help those who are not new to the market, but sort of the business leaders you're hoping to take to another level of their business? Any way, anything you'd like to amplify on your earlier remarks, or do they largely cover that? I
think, again, one of the thoughts came through my mind reading the report, and like Gustavo, you touched on this, was we're in, I think, as you did, John, the macro environment around geopolitics is pretty interesting at the moment. And I think if you saw the amount of trade with China and the potential risks associated with the lack of diversification, Latin America is extremely appealing in that regard. It's a massive market. It's complex to get into, but once you're in, the opportunity presents is significant. And also for companies that go in there, it's a bit of hard work up front, but the barriers to entry for other companies is quite significant. So once you're established, you actually have quite a strong position. So all I'd say is, again, I'd be pushing leaders of companies to not discount it. And you always hear about Australia and the US and Europe, but actually Latin America is often way down the ranks for companies, and I think we need to change that. Well, thank you. Let's now have a little bit of interactivity among the people to my right, to your left. Any questions either panelists want to answer John? And we could also give John the opportunity to respond to anything he's heard from either Gustavo or Nick so far.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I would love to learn more about 2 points that I think, as I said, the report is fairly nuanced, so I certainly appreciate this, and I recognize you can't fit everything in a report. But there are two questions that I have. The first one has to do with a revived sort of Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? Or the CPTPP. And there are references sprinkled throughout the report, so it certainly has taken this into account. But I would love to hear, John, your thoughts or others as to what difference will that make for the member countries, let's say Chile, Peru, Mexico, or will it, right? Will it make a difference? And the other point I would love to learn, and as Matthew shared, I've only been here for very little time in New Zealand, and I'm absolutely loving it. But I've gotten the sense and the opportunity to appreciate what I would describe as this ethos, the New Zealand ethos of environmental stewardship. And it, I think, can very easily relate to a similar ethos in parts of Latin America. Costa Rica certainly comes to mind, Uruguay, increasingly Ecuador, Cuba, that share a similar ethos, sort of a Latin American version of this ethos. But is there an opportunity there as well?
Yeah, two great questions. In terms of CPTPP, obviously that's a huge deal for New Zealand. It's the first time we've had liberalized trade with Japan and Mexico. Didn't quite get the US, but the door is always open, of course. So I think it's a hugely significant agreement for the region. The fact that it could get done at a period of very challenging political environment, the fact that it got signed at all was excellent. And what it really means is reduced transaction costs across the Asia Pacific, and potentially past the Asia Pacific as others such as the UK and potentially China and Taiwan, and as other countries seek to join, that's a very positive sign. They're seeing that this is a high ambition, high quality agreement that reduces barriers to trade, that reduces other transaction costs, that tries to promote digital trade, all of these things that a modern trading relationship is about. So I see CPTPP as hugely valuable. I see it expanding over time without a shadow of a doubt. I think that is certainly one blueprint. I know it's not the only blueprint for regional trade. There are Southeast Asian versions of it as well, but it's hugely beneficial for New Zealand and for members within it. On your second point around environmental sustainability, this is certainly an area of strength for New Zealand. And yeah, as we focus more and more on climate change, its damaging effects, I think there are certainly opportunities for New Zealand businesses, especially around agri-tech, renewable energy. Both of these things are real strengths of New Zealand because of our endowments. We're very fortunate to have built up that technology and expertise over time, and we can take those services to Latin America, and that's commercially beneficial for us, environmentally beneficial for everyone. So I see that as a real win-win in terms of an area for improvement between the two countries, two regions.
Thanks, Gustavo. I suppose a question I would have was, through your case studies with companies, we talked about a lot of the lessons learned, but were there any sort of resounding points that jumped out from those you interviewed, really about the critical things the government could be doing, or that New Zealand Inc. could be doing to support that growth? I've got certainly some views from our side, but it'd be great to hear if any sort of themes came out from those discussions, John.
Yeah, I'll make this a short answer because I can see you've done more thinking about it from a business perspective. But I think certainly one was just, let's get the region on the radar, which is why this sort of event is so helpful, and why the work of NZTE and MFAT and the Cape is so important. So I think that's the other thing. And then the other aspect was around, there are still trade barriers there. There are still challenges around non-tariff measures and customs procedures, and there certainly was a lot of desire to see trade agreements expanded, either bilaterally or regionally through there, to start chipping away at some of that red tape and some of those transaction costs. That would make it the region, or the countries within the region, just easier to do business with, and that improves their viability as a diversification option. But I'd be very keen to hear your views as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, John. I think both those are absolutely critical. I think the lack of awareness around the opportunities in Latin America are quite considerable. It sort of reminds me of New Zealand a while ago, when we were very well known for the All Blacks and sheep, and not much more. I know we've gone a long way, and I know that's probably quite some time ago, but it's one of those situations where a lot of people, when they try to think about Latin America, they don't necessarily think about the technology or the incredible businesses that are coming out of there. Interestingly, SoftBank in 2019 launched I think it was a $9 billion fund in Latin America, particularly focused on trying to drive technology companies and drive capital, which is a real tick of approval and an awareness of what's going on in Latin America. So I think those are important. It was interesting, I was recently down in Queenstown and noticed the sheer number of Latin Americans down there. So there's clearly a good participation in the country, but I think that's also very important. And I think it's one of those soft things where, by expanding access for students and itinerant travellers to come to the country, you start to form those relationships. I'm from Christchurch. We know a lot of Latin American people there. And that starts to build those informal networks, and that can only be helpful. That means all of a sudden, thinking about technology, hiring, recruiting, you start to think about, right, can we find a team of developers in Argentina, for example, or Chile, or Peru? And we know there's really, really competent people out there, but I don't think New Zealand knows that yet as well as they should do. So education around that and vocalizing that and showing examples of companies that are doing it well, I think is really critically important.
Well, you couldn't have scripted that any better, Nick, because we're about to show some examples of companies who are doing it really well. Not just you, we've also got Mario Winans from Pickpock here, who's another company featured in the report. But we're going to, this isn't the end of our panel discussion, and we will be able to open it up for questions soon. But we also want to show you, to actually reinforce what the report says about the individual case study success, because you'd think that they're quite different resources, but at the heart of, well, not at the heart, but the second section of the report does talk about case studies, as we've heard. So we try to present case studies in a variety of ways. These videos we're about to produce are of 5 SMEs, and they are recuts of earlier videos we did last year, which got over 100,000 views. Those videos talked about individual company experiences. These ones now actually take common experiences or common themes. So,
hello, my name is Michael Sullivan. I'm Creative Director and owner of a company called Many Minds in Auckland, New Zealand. Many Minds works on lots of New Zealand brands and services. However, we do a great deal of work for government, specifically around telling the New Zealand story overseas and helping exporters tell their story overseas. It's quite a unique skill and a lot of exporters need it. So if you're selling overseas, it's incredibly important that you hone your pitch. Pitches generally usually start with some connection, so immediately the audience connects with you. They're usually short and sharp and they make a point and they're memorable. If you're going into LatAm, a good thing to do is do your research, know your market, know your audience, know the B2B market. The Cape LatAm project was really enjoyable actually because we got to spend a lot of time with different companies, all with different stories and different experiences. So we spent a lot of time on the road. We asked lots and lots of questions and we got lots of different answers back, and the insights were quite amazing. One of our observations was that New Zealand creativity and ingenuity is as strong as ever. One of the things we discovered is that there's some amazing ideas out there that have taken shape and are doing really well. LatAm, we're very similar. They know a lot about us, a lot of good stuff, and there's a couple of shadows as well, but that's nothing that can't be fixed when it comes to doing business with them. Our location, we're seen as a bit remote, we're seen as a bit basic, a little bit too rural perhaps, when in actual fact, yes, we are to an extent, but we also have amazing cities, great infrastructure, great technology. So there were a few key insights. The first one I'll talk about is networks. It felt as though from all of the interviewees that they reached out and they connected quickly, and that connection grew bigger and faster, and the more aggressive they were at connecting, the more business sort of took off. So I think it's incredibly important to use those tools like LinkedIn to reach out and get in touch with people and start the conversation. It was amazing how many of the stories that we talked to that actually did something as simple as email. Scale is another huge opportunity. We tend to live in our little bubble here of New Zealand, which is awesome. But boy, these markets, if you take an idea that just takes off, it is huge. And I think any of the interviewees just talked about that. They just had no idea that something that could be 10x could be 150x just by giving it one try. Relationship is incredibly important. I think that from all of the interviews, it felt as though the business was good when Kiwis hooked up with the LatAm guys overseas, but it really took off when they went home, had a barbecue with the family, talked to their kids, and just found, again, that common ground, which kind of helps relationships take flight. So one of the really funny insights was the concept of mañana, which I'm sure you're probably aware of. Basically, you call somebody, they say that something's going to happen, and it doesn't. The learning from that was it seems to be consistent sort of behavior, but persistency seems to pay off because everybody who talked about it in the interviews, stuff did happen eventually, but it took a little while. So we're going to play 2 videos today. There are actually 8 in total, so if you get a chance, have a look and see if you can learn something. I know we did.
So what scale are we talking in Latin America? We asked Kiwi businesses who have been there.
I think one of the things that's really amazed me about working in Latin America is the scale of the market is just amazing.
Latin America, it is a huge economy and absolutely accepting of good quality technology and products.
So we looked at a number of markets globally. Latin America got a huge opportunity in terms of population and growth.
I guess the scale in terms of population alone is massive, and I think that's one of the biggest things that drew us to the market.
How big exactly?
The Brazilian dairy industry is huge. It's the 4th largest producer in the world. There's 25 million dairy cows. There's a population of 200 million people, and they're large consumers of dairy products.
Mexico, where we have one customer that has 7,000 trucks. Just to put that in comparison, the largest company in New Zealand has 400. That's quite an opportunity. And that's just one customer. So if we can crack one customer, but we're away, and then one will turn into 1 or 2 or 3, and it'll be a different world for MaxiLoader.
But also I think it because of its size, it can be deemed quite daunting.
How do you deal with that?
Don't be scared off.
You know, you've got to learn to walk before you run, so bite it off in small chunks.
All you need to do is find your niche, and the opportunities are huge.
So is it worth doing then?
Latin America has it all. You know, you've got amazing places, amazing culture. You've got huge industry that you can sell into, and you've got phenomenal people to work with.
There's lots of opportunities, and we've only just scratched the surface.
We've had our eyes opened up to the size of the market and the sophistication of the market, and New Zealand businesses are really well prepared to take on those challenges.
The market is ready for high-tech solutions. They have a huge middle class. They've got industry which relies on innovation and efficiencies.
You've got to take your idea that worked in New Zealand and got to change it to fit the market.
Our technology will help them to anticipate the capacity of their exporting process.
Having people on the ground is super important.
They are your eyes and ears and can really kind of help out with the small nuances of the market that you don't really get to understand until you're over there.
I was initially surprised by the tech scene in Brazil and the high level of education these developers had. Some of these developers, they're rock stars.
They're smart, they're well educated, they're experts in the area that they've chosen to work with. When you get them on your side and you collaborate with them, it's possible to do amazing things.
So, Nick, I'll start with you this time. What themes did you see featuring both in these videos and in the Sense Partners report?
In terms of themes, I think coming along, I was thinking about what would be the critical pieces of advice to companies trying to get going, which sort of ties in with some of the themes that came through there. And I think that, again, the scale of the market being so significant that being laser focused is true in any market, but certainly for Latin America. Secondly, don't underestimate the quality of the opportunity and the size of the opportunity. When we went to Brazil back in 2013, we were told it would probably take 3 times as long to get into the market and cost 3 times as much as we thought, but the opportunity would be 30 times what we believed. And it was that kind of thing which was absolutely true. You know, it played out after a number of years. So that's probably the second theme. And I probably the third theme was just around relationships. And you could sort of see coming through there, Luke from Fingermark, who I know well, talking about the rock stars that he works with over there and the relationships, and just you really must invest in the relationship and be in the market to understand it. So hopefully three or four little themes that popped up.
Thank you. A few minutes ago, and when even before John spoke, I talked about our past resources, and we've produced some really wonderful ones, but not everyone knows about them, and we've now got a brilliant comms person, and people are beginning to know these ones. But how could you, as an exporter, as now as a consultant, share knowledge of these resources among your peers?
Well, potentially, I suppose. Well, linking through to the work you're doing on social, so you'll be, as you said, you'll be communicating and commenting on those. Being aware of it, I speak with companies quite regularly who are thinking about Latin America. So again, being able to point them in the direction, and then I think fundamentally it's about peer-to-peer learning. So I think another thing that this group could continue to do would be to build up a network of people like Mario and myself and others who have been active in the market, and I'm sure many of them would be happy to have conversations with those who are looking to go into Latin America.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really great point, because as I said before, people like the Cape, we are self-identified champions, but peers need to speak to peers and change views and get beyond the superficial impressions of the market to actually point out the deeper realities. Gustavo, so again, from your vast experience of being in New Zealand here, how would you take these videos, and you might actually bring it back to the report as well, how could you take resources like these home to speak to, for example, to your business studies students in the US, and how could that in turn grow potential connections maybe between US academia or US students and New Zealand institutions, all oriented towards Latin America?
Absolutely. So my first reaction, I teach a course at the business school at Cornell that is on global issues for business. And I think of it as a course on political risk and macro planning for business. And it's so interesting. I think most students immediately think about business opportunities in the US and China, right? So those are immediately what first comes to mind. But I think what the report does very nicely, and I'll incorporate this into my syllabus, is really sort of expand the realm of possibilities and help students understand not only the challenges, but think creatively as to how to find business opportunities in perhaps unconventional settings, right? We could maybe put it that way. I think both the report and the videos do a very nice job at highlighting certainly the size of the market, as Nick mentioned, but also specific, I think the report and the videos call it sort of niche, finding the right niche or niche opportunities. And fintech is one that immediately comes to mind. I think there's a booming fintech market and industry in Latin America. And one of the key parts or ingredients that has made this possible is really the sort of qualified labor that is very, very qualified in terms of making the fintech industry possible. It's not necessarily what one would immediately think about when one thinks of fintech. I think maybe other people might think about India or other places. But I really appreciated how both the report and the videos emphasize this. And I think the qualified labor in the region represents a major opportunity for New Zealand's firms as well. That it's a resource waiting to be tapped. And the cost of labor is not particularly high, even qualified labor in Latin America. So that's certainly something that I think both highlighted very nicely. And it's something that I would certainly use for my own instruction at Cornell.
If I could just to add to that point around the labor, I think the one thing the pandemic's taught us is that we can work successfully with teams who are remote. And I think for a lot of companies, we've focused on trying to have teams close together, and that's really important for culture. But what the pandemic's taught us is that we can bring teams together, which I think then opens up labour markets like Latin America as an opportunity which we would not have previously seen.
John, any response to those responses, or alternatively, as well as, if you like, any thoughts on the videos and how they dovetail or reinforce or differ from your analysis?
Maybe just two comments. First of all, Nick mentioned here the importance of being able to access skilled workers in Latin America. Our unemployment rate's at 3.2%. Anyone who's trying to hire anyone in New Zealand right now is doing it pretty tough. The way we do business now means that you don't have to hire in New Zealand. You can hire smart people offshore, and I think PickPock have done this. I think other companies have done it as well. So, I think opening our eyes up and exploring some of the skilled workers that are resident across Latin America is a very sensible idea. Secondly, in terms of the video, I was just struck by the colours and the culture. And I think probably as your next project, you need to invest in a consultancy to do a study tour just to ground truth all of the findings in the report. It would only 20 countries, 4 or 5 months. So I'll let you know if I can think of anyone who could help.
We'll have a think ourselves. That's a great way to open it up to close this sort of internal discussion now. We're going to leave time for networking afterwards, and we're going to invite Sarah Lee from Foreign Affairs to make some closing remarks. But let's have some questions from the audience here. And again, because we're recording this, we will have to pass the mic back and forth. So if you could, two things, the usual requests. Please say who you are, where you're from, and make a question, not a statement.
Well, thank you. Is this on? Okay. Phil Quinn from New Zealand Export Credit. We're part of Treasury. Got three questions really, if I may, Matthew. One mainly to you, John, but also to all the panelists, Nick as well. Might have some insights. Would it be fair to say that the only true obstacle to actually doing business in Latin America would be the cost of getting both goods to market and set up costs there? All things being equal, and we saw there was no other anything more detrimental compared to other markets. The second question I had was on one of your slides. You mentioned the export services volumes went down. You mentioned because of the pandemic, but I noticed that it started about 2018, and so I was just wondering whether there's other reasons why that might be the case. And the third one was you had a graph on infrastructure quality versus GDP. I was wondering, how do you measure infrastructure quality? You know, what's behind all that? How does that compare? You had some comparison there.
Sure. Well, I might leave the first question to the experts in the market. So let's go in reverse order. The infrastructure quality score is just an index that we took from another provider, and it ranks a wide range of types of infrastructure, both physical and soft, and on a comparative basis, and gives it. It's one of these aggregated indices where the devil is in the detail, but as a broad measure of infrastructure quality, I think it worked okay. The second question was around, what was your second question? Oh yeah, well, services. I'm not. I can't think of anything in particular that would drive tourism or education down in 2018. So no, I'll have to look into that further. I don't know. That's a good question, and I'll hand over to you for that.
So regarding the first question, really, were there any other constraints other than cost and? Yeah, sure. No, I'd agree with you. I think that there is absolutely no barrier to entry really in entering Latin American markets. The biggest, not an actual barrier, but the biggest thing to think about is just it takes more planning. Jumping on a plane over to Australia takes 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is, and it's relatively similar. Latin America has a range of different markets which are complex. So, for example, in Brazil, withholding tax issues, different tax structures, to Chile, to Peru. So I think like any market, you need to do your due diligence, plan properly, and be very clear, be well capitalized, and then commit. But other than that, I mean, I think I'd give that advice to someone entering any global market, not just Latin America.
Well, if I could just briefly add, one of the challenges I think is just cultural, right? I mean, I think the video mentioned sort of mañana, right? What does that actually mean, and how people follow through on this? I would add sort of the concept of ahora or even ahorita, right? Which just, I mean, it just gets very complicated. It can be discouraging for sure, but I think if one goes just, clear-eyed as to what to expect, then it becomes a lot easier for sure.
And just on the culture piece, I've had the joy or the pleasure or the difficulty of opening up various different markets around the world, including Russia and African markets. And I've got to say, there's something about doing business in Latin America which is just fun, enjoyable. The people are great, and business is hard, travel's hard, it's not glamorous. So to be able to do it in a market where people are generally, it's very enjoyable, they enjoy what they do, is very underestimated. For businesses. So on that alone, I'd encourage it. Maybe not an economic reason for going, but
a good reason to convince people to look at it. George.
Good afternoon. George Troop, formerly MFAT in various roles, including as APEC senior official and ambassador to Mexico and 4 neighbouring countries. A question for John, former colleague, following up from a comment by Nick. The study distills some very sensible looking takeaways on what works. I was wondering if in the course of your work you came across any particularly striking examples of what not to do.
The answer, that's a really good question, because you can learn as much from those as you can, all the winners. Look, no, we didn't, given the study time and resources available, So there's definitely a selection bias problem with those that are in the, well, it's not a problem. But no, we didn't look at those who'd gone in and gone out, and there are some fairly high profile ones, such as, Fonterra's sort of been in and come out as its business strategy has changed. But again, I might hand it back over to you, Nick. You're probably much better connected than I am in terms of businesses that have gone there and perhaps haven't done so well, or have had to have a couple of goes.
Thanks, John. So I think a couple of things that you'd advise not to do, and one is fairly obvious, is not to dip your toe in. So, and I don't mean drop in for a visit and do some due diligence, but going into a market like Latin America it's a long-term commitment, and I think a company needs to take a 10 to 15-year view and plan accordingly. One of the experiences we had early days going to Brazil, so we were selling to large mineral companies like Vale and BHP and Rio Tinto, all those kinds of companies. And in fact, Vale was one of the reasons we went to Brazil. But they said, we won't buy from you until you're in the market and we're comfortable that you'll be around in 5 years' time. So I guess a lesson is not to jump in and jump out. Another lesson is probably cultural, which is not to be transactional, which is to say, take the time to build relationships. Don't go into a meeting and say, right, let's get going. What are we buying? What are we selling? I mean, it's a nuance, but it's an important one. So just a couple of don't do's.
Thank you. Oh, one final question from someone. We need to allow some time for networking. Yes, last question.
Hi, my name is Dominic Touchot. I have my own consultancy, but I'm also a Latin American lover. Lived in Chile and Panama for about 10 years, my whole life, and I'm married to a Kiwi, so that's how I end up here. If you had one magic wand, because we're talking a lot about culture and relationship, would you suppress the barrier language or the tax and the tariffs?
Yeah. The trade negotiators are telling me that it's all about tariffs. Ultimately, you can do business past tariffs, and I'm sorry, MFAT. Sorry, I'm not going to get any more business from MFAT for a while, but that's okay. Over time, tariffs in general are coming down, and you can do business around tariffs. Language barriers and cultural barriers do persist, but they can also be addressed as well. So I think the lack of familiarity is I don't want to call it a barrier because it makes it sound a negative thing. It's a huge opportunity, and everyone can invest in improving their cultural and language abilities, whereas reducing trade barriers, that's just a few people at MFAT who are going to do that.
Okay, we're almost ready to wrap up because we've got a low time. We've got some lovely food at the back. Any final remarks, or should we pass over to Sarah now? Any burning questions people want to say?
No.
Well done. Correct answer. It was a leading question, wasn't it, really? John, Gustavo? Okay. Well, it's now my great pleasure to invite Sarah Lee from MFAT, the Americas division, the head of the Latin American section of the Americas division, to make some closing remarks, which is only entirely appropriate because if the idea wasn't hers, it was certainly Sarah who brought it to our attention. So key person in this whole project, giving advice throughout. So please, Sarah, some thoughts from you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. So nice to see you all here today. Some familiar faces and some new ones, which is really, really pleasing. There has been a really great focus in the report on partnership and collaboration, and that came through the videos as well. And I'd just like to say that MFAT really enjoyed this particular collaboration. And we're grateful for the extra perspectives that have come from everybody involved in this project, from CAPE, from Sense Partners, from our business community, from our academic and our government advisory boards. It really helps us refine our messaging, I guess. Our messaging to New Zealanders who are looking into the region. And knowledge is power, right? So having the underlying data for us helps us also refine those messages and identify the areas where we as government can work harder, where we can support businesses, and where we can tap into our academic colleagues as well for some more insights. I loved Gustavo's focus on engaging with Latin American partners as values partners. I think that's something that comes across very strongly in our work at MFAT. Our Latin American partners are not just partners for the dollars. They're really key strategic and values partners for us as well. But I think that flows through into the connections that come through education and business. When Nick says it's fun to do business in Latin America, it's also about connecting with people who see the world in a similar way, I think. I really enjoyed Nick's points on the importance of getting Latin America on the radar here in New Zealand. We all need to be amplifiers for this, so if there's one thing that I can ask you to do when you leave this room is to help us. We have a role to interrogate the data and then to disseminate it, and thank you very much for providing that for us, Sense Partners and John. One last point was to pick up on Gustavo, I think it was you who brought up the environmental stewardship and sustainability point. That's something I think quite a lot about in my role, and to me it's a really obvious observation that Latin America and New Zealand are global food baskets, and it's in everyone's benefit, business and our communities, to be able to help us all figure out how to do that sustainably. And so that's a really big opportunity that I think a lot about how to get people behind. So once again, thank you very much. I look forward to reading the report again and then asking everybody else if they have done likewise. And thank you very much, Nick and Gustavo, for your extra perspectives too. Thanks, Matthew.